I've worked with people who've seen war, who've survived torture, who've lost everything and come back with barely a mind left to speak. But nothing prepared me for the day Oprah looked at me and asked if I believed in ancient bloodlines that fed demons. Her first ritual ended with 12 masked figures cutting her open and calling something into her body that has never left. When I asked why she never had children, she smiled and said, "Because I refused to give them another vessel." And as a therapist, this might be quite unprofessional, but it was for this very reason I gave up my career to speak the truth. There are levels of darkness that should be repeated for no reason, especially if you know that the lives of many innocent people might be tied to your silence. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now. What comes next is worse than anything she said in that room. I used to think therapy was just listening, being steady for someone else. For a while, that was enough. You take in people's pain, help them carry it a little longer. Then they leave, and you stay behind. That idea doesn't hold forever. Some stories don't pass through you. They stay. You hear something you're not supposed to, and it shifts something inside you. Quietly. Slowly. You start forgetting which thoughts are yours. Oprah came in during a season when I was already tired. I didn't feel starstruck, just curious about why she wanted this. First few sessions were straightforward. Nothing dramatic. Just history, milestones, a life of control and structure. But there was no emotion in the retelling. Not even the surface kind. Her voice didn't crack. Her eyes never shifted. Every part of it felt managed. Like she'd scrubbed it clean before bringing it in. Over time, the room felt heavier during her appointments. I'd leave with headaches I couldn't explain. Sit in silence afterward, trying to shake the sense that something else had entered with her and never fully left. She mentioned a place once. Said it was far up, somewhere cold, hard to find unless you already knew where to go. There were no press or phones allowed. No names exchanged. People gathered in silence and waited. I asked what for. She didn't respond. Her hand lifted and rested flat against her chest. Not in pain, not for attention. Just steady. She stayed like that until the session ended. Later that night, I opened her file to take notes. At the top of the entry, a new line had appeared. Some lines aren't meant to be crossed even in memory. I didn't write it, and no one else had access. That was when I stopped thinking of this as work. Something had already crossed through. I didn't ask her to go deeper. Whatever this gathering was, I figured if she wanted to unpack it, she would. That's what you tell yourself in this field. Don't push, don't lead, just hold the space. But the more time passed, the harder it became to ignore how much of her life pointed back to that one event. It came out slowly. Not in one clean story, but over weeks, in moments where her guard slipped for a few seconds at a time. She never gave names, never offered dates. But every detail she did share made the picture harder to live with. She told me the first invitation came in a casual conversation. Something slipped in between industry talk. Nothing that sounded unusual at first, but a few days later, a second person brought it up. Then another. Different cities, different contexts, all of them asking the same thing. Are you ready to see how things really work? She said yes. I don't think she fully understood what she was agreeing to. The trip was arranged without her input. A flight appeared on her schedule. A driver picked her up without speaking. The plane had no logos, no attendants, no markings. Just a short flight followed by a long, twisting drive into the mountains. When she asked where they were headed, no one answered. The house, she told me, wasn't large in a grand sense. It was old, made of stone, with tall windows and floors that never made a sound. Inside, there were no decorations, no photographs, no color, just pale walls, sharp corners, and silence. Everyone there moved in sync. They didn't speak to her, but they looked at her like they already knew her role. She said it felt less like walking into a room and more like walking into a performance that had already started without her. She was led to a hall with 12 chairs arranged in a circle. No centerpieces. No rituals being explained. Just the circle, the breathing, and a kind of pressure in the air that she said made her teeth hurt. I asked if she knew what they were waiting for. She said no, but her voice changed when she said it. She told me it wasn't a person, not something human. That's when her face went blank for a second, and her fingers pressed against her ribs like something inside her remembered more than her words could explain. She told me the last thing she remembered before going blank was the way the room changed. The air went dry. The walls seemed to lean in, and something began to take shape, not fully human, but not quite creature either. She said their faces didn't have eyes, not in the way we do, and that they moved without sound, stepping forward one by one, until the space between the chairs was full of them. Then everything was cut to black. When she woke up, her clothes were still on. No one spoke. Everyone had already left. She said she couldn't remember leaving the building. Just being in her car hours later, parked outside her own house, with her hands still shaking and a smell she couldn't name clinging to her skin. And I remember sitting there across from her, realizing I hadn't written a single note. My hands were just resting in my lap. I didn't want to touch anything. I didn't want to move. It was the first time in years I felt afraid to be in the room. I'd started to think the gathering was the root of everything. That whatever happened there had carved something deep into her. But that wasn't the beginning, not even close. The bloodline talk came later, when the sessions had gone quiet for a while. She'd stopped speaking openly. Sometimes we'd sit for the full hour with barely a few words exchanged. I didn't push. But I could feel the pressure building again, like something was waiting for permission to surface. Then one session, without warning, she looked up and said, "They don't call it a bloodline because of genetics. It's about commitment." I asked what she meant. She told me about the families. Not just wealthy or powerful, but something older than all that. People who don't run industries. They design them. The ones who don't seek fame because they already own the structures that create it. According to her, every generation, each family is expected to give something up. Something personal, something irreplaceable. It wasn't always a child, she said, but it often was. She didn't describe it as murder. That word didn't fit. It was something closer to an offering. A trade that sealed your place. One generation would bleed, and the next would thrive. Not publicly, not violently, but in a way that made the world rearrange itself around whoever remained. I asked why someone would agree to that. Her response was quiet, because most of them were raised inside it. It's not a decision. It's an inheritance. She didn't name anyone, but she described the pressure, the conversations that start in whispers, the expectations handed down not through threats but through rituals, everything done with a smile, everything wrapped in tradition. I remember her saying, "It's not a room full of monsters. It's a room full of people who've accepted what they are." Then her voice dropped, and she said something I haven't repeated until now. They asked me who I'd give. And when I told them I had no children, they said maybe I wasn't ready to belong. There was something broken in the way she said it. Not regret, something colder, emptier. Like a part of her had once believed she could prove herself without making the same trade. But now she wasn't so sure. She told me she spent years believing her legacy would be enough. The work, the reach, the image she built. But over time, that wasn't the question anymore. The question became why she had never brought a child forward at all. She said they asked her again. Quietly, politely, in rooms that were never recorded. And every time she refused, something in her life changed. A deal fell through. A connection went silent. Whole projects collapsed without warning. Not loud sabotage. Just silence, absence, opportunity turning its back. By the end of the session, she looked exhausted. Not from speaking, but from holding it in for so long. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. Just sat with her hands pressed flat on her knees, waiting for the hour to end. And I remember thinking, Maybe this was the closest thing to honesty I was ever going to get from her. There's a way people carry themselves when they've already made a decision but haven't admitted it out loud. I started seeing that in her. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't strength either. It felt like watching someone let go of a rope they'd been gripping for too long. She never came in and said she wanted out. That's not how people like her speak. But over time, I started to understand. She wasn't just walking away from a group. She was trying to stop something she'd been part of for years. Something that didn't want to be left behind. She told me the meetings started to change. Familiar faces stopped returning her calls. Invitations didn't come. Projects she was promised quietly disappeared. The people she'd built with, traveled with, appeared less and less. No one accused her of anything. No one said it to her directly. But the message was clear. She described how it felt to show up at events where she used to be the center of the room, only to find eyes avoiding hers. Conversations she would have led now happened without her. Opportunities went elsewhere. Not because she failed, but because something had shifted behind the scenes and she wasn't included in it anymore. It wasn't just the public distance. She said things in her private life began to feel different too. Small things. Friends hesitating. Staff quitting without warning. Rumors starting in places she didn't expect. The kind of pressure that doesn't hit all at once. It just keeps rising until you can't tell when it started or how deep it's gone. That's when she told me what she tried to do. She thought if she kept building, kept giving to the world, that it would outweigh the expectations behind her. But she eventually realized that was never the point. She said, this was always about what you're willing to lose. That's the cost. That's the real belonging. Then she said something I've never repeated until now. I didn't have children on purpose. I knew what they'd ask for eventually. I thought that would protect me. Her voice didn't shake. There was no guilt in it. Just a kind of stillness, like the decision had hardened into her long ago. But she wasn't sure anymore if it had worked. She started describing strange things after that, waking up in unfamiliar rooms of her own home, hearing a voice humming through the walls. Never words, just a low sound that faded the moment she tried to follow it. She said objects moved overnight. Things she hadn't touched in weeks would appear by her bedside. Doors she always locked were sometimes wide open in the morning. One night, she found a single feather resting under her pillow. Thin and gray, almost silver. She didn't keep birds. There was no break-in. Nothing stolen. Just that feather and the feeling that she wasn't alone. She said she'd started sleeping in different places. The closet, her car, anywhere that felt untouched. When I asked her what she thought was happening, she waited a long time before answering. If I've really broken the pattern, she said, then something is coming to repair it. That was the last thing she said in that session. She stood up before the hour ended and walked out without looking back. I remember sitting there afterward, not moving, just watching the space she'd left behind and trying to understand what it meant for her to walk away and for me to be the one holding the pieces. I didn't plan to keep digging after she left. It wasn't part of the job. Therapists aren't supposed to follow clients into the world they're trying to escape. But something about what she said stayed with me. It didn't feel like a story. It felt like a warning. Like something passed from one person to another because carrying it alone had become too heavy. She had called them Nephilim. I'd heard the word before, buried in old mythology or sermons, but I never paid attention to it. This time, it felt different. She said it plainly, like someone who didn't need to convince me, only document it. That's what started it. The first search brought up religious references. Giants, divine beings, a forbidden union between spirit and flesh. Some sites called it myth. Others treated it like suppressed history. But none of them spoke about it like she had. So I kept going. I read academic essays, forum posts, old book scans, anything that wasn't widely shared. There were threads about bloodlines, not traced through royalty, but through influence. Names that came up often enough to make you feel like you'd missed something obvious. Boards of corporations, global foundations, industries that seemed disconnected but weren't. At first, I chalked it up to conspiracy talk, but it wasn't the claims that got to me, it was the repetition. People separated by time and language pointing to the same figures, the same places, the same pattern. Those who controlled the gateways to fame, wealth, and safety weren't just powerful. They were part of something older, not passed down through ideas, but through blood. Some writers said these families weren't descendants of the Nephilim. They were caretakers. Others claimed they were direct. Either way, the belief was the same, that some lineages carried something that let them shape the world in quiet ways. They didn't run for office or perform on stage. They selected who would. The deeper I went, the more names I started to recognize, not in the texts themselves, those were always vague, but in the patterns. People who seemed to appear overnight, rise fast, and become untouchable. And others who disappeared the moment they stepped out of line, not fallen stars, erased ones. There were whispers about how these decisions were made, ceremonies, pacts, not violent, not public, just arrangements, sacrifices that weren't always physical. Sometimes it was loyalty, sometimes silence, sometimes something else entirely. I wasn't sleeping well. I'd start reading at night and lose hours without noticing. I stopped turning on the TV. Every commercial, every news clip felt like it had a hidden layer I hadn't seen before. Not symbols or codes, just faces. Familiar ones. Faces I'd seen clients talk about. Faces that felt closer now than they used to. It wasn't fear at first. It was fascination. But that changed when I realized I hadn't told anyone what I was doing. Not because I didn't want to, but because something about it felt private. Like I was carrying a secret that hadn't fully revealed itself yet, and I was waiting for it to finish. This wasn't just about what Oprah had said. This was about what she didn't say. And I was beginning to understand why. I kept going, even when I knew I shouldn't. Not because I was brave, but because something in me needed to know how deep it really went. If you feel that too, subscribe. I don't know who else would understand any of this. I started noticing small changes first. The kind you can ignore if you want to. I'd wake up feeling heavier than when I went to sleep. My body worked, but it felt off, like I was walking through something thicker than air. The research hadn't stopped. If anything, it became part of my routine. I'd see clients during the day, then dive back in at night. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was tracking patterns. And the more I found, the harder it became to feel present in my own life. Names I'd come across in my searches started appearing in conversations, not always directly. Sometimes it was background chatter, someone mentioning a new appointment to a board, a surprise endorsement, a strange collaboration between two people who had no reason to work together. And every time I heard it, I felt that pressure behind my eyes, that quiet recognition that I was seeing too much. I stopped bringing it up with anyone, not out of fear. I didn't feel threatened, just watched, not by a person, but by the idea that something now expected me to stay quiet too. One night, I was reading an old article on elite philanthropy networks when I realized I hadn't blinked in a long time. My eyes were dry, my breathing shallow. I wasn't just reading, I was waiting, but I didn't know for what. I got up, walked to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the way I was standing. My shoulders were too stiff. My jaw was clenched like I'd been bracing for something. I went back to bed, but I couldn't fall asleep. Not because I was scared, because it felt like if I let my guard down, something would catch up to me. It wasn't long before I started dreaming. Not vivid nightmares, more like echoes. The same hallway, repeating. A staircase that curved down but never reached a floor. Voices I couldn't place, speaking a language I couldn't hold on to. I'd wake up with phrases in my head I'd never heard before, and they'd vanish by morning. During a session with a longtime client, I lost track of time. Not in the usual way. This was different. I looked down to take a note, and when I looked back up, he was staring at me like I'd said something I hadn't meant to. I asked if he was okay. He said I'd been speaking under my breath. I didn't remember saying anything. That night I found a book on my shelf I didn't recognize. No title. Thin. Inside were handwritten notes, not mine. At least, I don't think they were. The first page read, "They don't warn you what the knowing costs." I sat there for a long time, holding it, not reading, just sitting. Because for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was still researching something, or if it had started researching me. I don't practice anymore. Haven't for a while. I never made an announcement. Just stopped taking new clients, then old ones. Let the sessions run dry until there was nothing left to return to. People asked if I was burned out. If the years finally caught up to me, I let them think that. It was easier than trying to explain the truth, that some stories don't leave you, even when the person telling them does. There was no single moment that broke me. It was slow, quiet, like water wearing down stone. You start thinking you're just holding space for others, but over time, you realize some of what they carry has blood into you. And when it's not just grief or guilt, but something darker, older, and deliberate, it starts to change the way you see everything. I can't walk into crowded places anymore without scanning faces. Not for threats, but for signs. I don't watch interviews. I can't. Too many things I recognize now. Gestures, phrases, eyes that look too tired for the words they're saying. I don't know if they've all made the same choice, but I know they've all been given the chance. As for her, I haven't seen her since the last time she walked out of my office. But she's still present, still visible, still powerful, maybe even more than before. She didn't disappear. She didn't renounce anything. Whatever that inner conflict was, that hesitation, that regret, it didn't win. Something else did, and I can only assume she gave them what they asked for. Maybe not in the way they expected, but something was handed over. The most painful part isn't what she told me. It's knowing she had a chance to walk away. She stood at the edge of it, saw what it really was, and still went back in. And because she did, the influence she carries now feels different. It's not just popularity or wealth, it's deeper. Like something is speaking through her, not to her. People still treat her like a force for good. They quote her, praise her, follow her life. And maybe part of her still believes in that role. But the price she paid isn't something that can be undone. I saw too much of it behind her eyes. She didn't just give in, she aligned with it. Sometimes I wonder if she came to me not for help, but to confess, to offload what was left of her conscience before it fully dissolved. I don't think she needed saving. I think she needed someone to witness what she chose and stay quiet. I've kept quiet longer than I should have. And even now, I'm not saying this to fix anything. I know better than that. The ones who built this structure aren't threatened by truth. They rely on disbelief. They know you'll hear stories like this and file them away as paranoia, or delusion, or just entertainment. That's how it survives. So no, I'm not asking you to do anything. Just remember, because if they ever come asking for something from you, a favor, a silence, a child, you'll need to decide whether you're strong enough to stand alone, or whether you'll do what she did and disappear in plain sight. If any part of this made sense to you, don't keep it to yourself. Like it, share it, subscribe. That's how stories like this survive. Not through headlines, but through people who choose to remember what others are told to forget.